Hey guys, tonight we're talking about Rome, the empire that conquered half the known world and still found time to be extremely petty about it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When Rome captured a queen, it did not see a defeated woman sitting quietly in a tent wondering how everything went so wrong. Rome saw a logistical nightmare wrapped in a crown. Queens were not standard prisoners. They could not be processed, catalogued and forgotten like a sack of captured spears. They were walking political problems with excellent posture and very bad timing. Rome loved order. Rome loved hierarchy. Rome loved rules. And a captured queen broke several of them just by existing. She had ruled. She had commanded armies. People had obeyed her willingly, which already made her suspicious. Worse still, she had done all of this without Roman permission, paperwork, or supervision. Frankly, the audacity. To Rome, a queen was not dangerous because she could fight. She was dangerous because people believed in her. Soldiers obey orders. Followers believe. Belief is much harder to kill, and Rome preferred not to leave unfinished business lying around. This is why Rome didn't treat queens like ordinary captives. A regular prisoner could be sold, enslaved, or executed without much thought. A queen required meetings, discussions, someone inevitably saying, "We can't just kill her, people are watching." Rome was many things, but subtle without an audience was not one of them. Rome also had a talent for turning personal tragedy into public education. A captured queen was a gift, not to her, obviously, but to the empire's messaging department. She could be displayed, paraded, whispered about, and pointed at. Rome could say, without speaking a word, "This is what happens when you try ruling on your own." And Rome loved a good visual. A queen stripped of power but kept alive was far more effective than a corpse. A dead queen could become a martyr. A living, humiliated queen became a warning label with legs. There was also the issue of ego. Rome did not like being challenged, and it especially disliked being challenged by someone who wore a crown and didn't answer to a Roman man with a clipboard. The punishment had to be thorough. It had to be humiliating, and it had to be memorable. So from the moment a queen was captured, her fate was no longer about justice, mercy, or even revenge. It became a performance review conducted by an empire with excellent attendance. She was no longer a ruler. She was a lesson. Rome liked power arranged neatly. Power flowed upward, stopped at Rome, and did not ask questions. Anything outside that structure made Romans uncomfortable, and nothing made them more uncomfortable than a rival ruler who appeared to be doing just fine without Roman supervision. Kings were annoying, but familiar. Rome had been dealing with kings for centuries. They were predictable. They argued, negotiated, paid tribute, and eventually lost wars in an orderly fashion. Queens, however, introduced an additional layer of discomfort. Not because Rome had never seen powerful women, it absolutely had, but because a queen ruling independently broke several unspoken rules at once. A ruling queen suggested that authority did not require Roman approval, Roman bloodlines, or Roman institutions. Even worse, it suggested that loyalty could exist outside Rome's carefully managed ecosystem. From a Roman perspective, this was not rebellion. This was ideological contamination. Rome did not officially say, "We dislike female rulers." Rome was far too sophisticated for that. Instead, Roman writers quietly framed queens as unnatural, excessive, emotional, or dangerously charismatic. Anything that suggested their rule was an anomaly rather than a legitimate system. This was less about gender and more about control. Rome disliked anyone who made ruling look achievable without them. And let's be honest, Rome also hated competition. A queen who successfully governed, inspired loyalty, and resisted Rome made the empire look temporarily fallible. Rome did not do fallible. Rome did inevitability. So when such a queen was captured, Rome saw an opportunity, not simply to punish, but to correct the narrative. Her capture allowed Rome to say, "See, this arrangement was always unstable." Her humiliation reinforced the idea that sovereignty outside Rome was not just doomed, it was embarrassing. This is why Roman punishments for queens were so carefully designed. They were not impulsive acts of cruelty. They were lectures delivered in chains. Rome wanted other rulers, male or female, to observe the outcome and internalize the lesson without requiring further explanation. And of course, Rome never admitted fear, but fear was there. Fear that authority might exist independently. Fear that loyalty could survive conquest. Fear that someone somewhere might watch a queen resist Rome and think, maybe we could do that too. Rome did not punish captured queens because they had lost. Rome punished them because they had once ruled, and for a moment, ruled well. For a Roman enemy queen, capture was not the end of the story. It was the paperwork phase. The war might be over, the city burned, the army scattered, but Rome was only just getting started. Rome never rushed consequences. It preferred to savour them. The moment a queen was taken alive, her fate stopped being about battlefield realities and became a matter of scheduling. She was no longer a combatant. She was an asset, and Rome, like any competent empire, did not waste assets. Captured queens were transported carefully. Not gently, just carefully enough to ensure they arrived intact. You cannot stage a public lesson if the lesson expires on the road. Guards were instructed to keep her alive, visible, and unmistakably defeated. This was not mercy. This was preparation. Rome also understood that time itself was a weapon. Weeks or months might pass between capture and public punishment. During that silence, rumours spread. Did she survive? Was she executed? Was she being paraded through Roman streets? Uncertainty did the work of fear long before chains ever clinked. Meanwhile, Roman officials debated what role she would play. Would she be marched in a triumph? Kept alive as leverage? Quietly erased later? Rome loved options. A captured queen gave the empire flexibility, and Rome valued flexibility almost as much as it valued making examples. For the queen herself, this waiting period was its own punishment. No information, no timeline, no control. She had ruled armies and peoples, and now her future depended on men who discussed her fate between wine cups and administrative complaints. It was power stripped down to its absence. Rome had learned through experience that immediate executions created martyrs. Martyrs inspired songs, stories, and inconvenient rebellions. Rome preferred something colder. A living queen, held in limbo, sent a stronger message. Resistance does not end quickly, and it does not end cleanly. This period also allowed Rome to dismantle her identity. Titles were ignored. Royal status was treated as irrelevant. She was referred to not as a ruler, but as the woman, the captive, or the barbarian. Language mattered. Rome was already rewriting her story before the public ever saw her. By the time the queen reappeared, whether in chains or in silence, she was no longer presented as a leader who had challenged Rome. She was presented as proof that challenging Rome was a terrible long-term plan. Capture was not the conclusion. It was the setup. To modern ears, a triumph sounds pleasant. Something involving applause, smiles, and maybe a tasteful speech. Rome's triumph was none of those things. It was a victory parade designed by people who believed humiliation was a public service. A triumph was Rome's way of turning conquest into theatre. Streets were cleared, temples were opened, crowds gathered, and at the centre of it all marched the spoils of war: treasure, weapons, exotic animals, and most importantly, defeated enemies who were still alive. For a captured queen, the triumph was not an honour. It was the most carefully choreographed insult imaginable. She was paraded through Rome behind the victorious general, sometimes in chains, sometimes bound with symbolic restraints that ensured everyone noticed she was no longer in charge. The crowd did not need instructions. They understood their role immediately. This was the part where you stare, whisper, laugh, and remember that Rome wins. Rome loved visual storytelling. The Queen's presence was meant to contrast sharply with the general riding high, wrapped in purple, pretending to be almost divine for the day. She walked. He rode. She followed. He led. The message was so clear it barely needed translation. Her appearance was deliberately foreign. Roman triumphs emphasized difference. Strange clothing, unfamiliar jewellery, unusual hairstyles, all of it designed to reinforce the idea that she came from a lesser world that had been neatly folded into Roman dominance. Rome did not just conquer territories, it conquered narratives. The crowd mattered. Rome could have punished her privately. It chose not to. A punishment unseen was a wasted opportunity. Tens of thousands of people watching ensured that the humiliation would echo far beyond the city. Stories would spread. Travellers would repeat them. Future rebels would picture her before ever lifting a sword, and Rome enjoyed the delay. The triumph often happened long after the war ended. By then, the Queen had been waiting, aware of what was coming but powerless to stop it. Anticipation sharpened the cruelty. Rome did not shout during triumphs. It did not need to. Silence, chains, and contrast did all the work. The Queen's role was simple: exist as living evidence of Roman inevitability. By the time the triumph ended, the lesson had already been delivered. Everything that followed was just administration. Rome understood something fundamental about power. You don't just defeat an enemy. You redesign how they are seen. And nothing reshapes perception faster than clothing. For a captured queen, what she wore during her punishment was never accidental. It was costume design for an empire that treated humiliation like a fine art. Queens who had once appeared in royal robes, heavy with symbolism and authority, were stripped of everything that made them look like rulers. Their clothing during a triumph was chosen carefully, exotic enough to mark them as foreign, elaborate enough to draw attention, and unfamiliar enough to invite mockery. Rome wanted the crowd to see difference first, dignity second, and humanity somewhere much later. This was not about comfort. It was about contrast. Roman spectators were meant to compare the defeated queen's appearance to the victorious general towering above her in ceremonial purple. One embodied order and civilization. The other embodied chaos that had been corrected. Rome loved a visual metaphor it didn't have to explain. Even jewellery mattered. Items that once signalled power were reduced to curiosities. Necklaces became trophies. Crowns became props. Sometimes queens were allowed to wear symbols of their former status, not out of respect, but because seeing authority emptied of power was more satisfying than seeing it removed entirely. Rome believed humiliation worked best when it reminded everyone what had been lost, and the crowd noticed everything. Whispers travelled fast. Comments were made. Comparisons followed. She ruled them? Someone would say, looking her up and down. Rome relied on that reaction. The empire outsourced part of its punishment to public opinion. There was also a deeper message hidden in the fabric. By emphasizing foreignness, Rome reinforced the idea that this queen had never truly belonged in the world of power. Her rule was framed as a strange anomaly rather than a legitimate system. Rome didn't say she was unfit to rule, it let her clothing suggest it. For the queen herself, the effect was devastating. Clothing is identity. To be forced into garments that redefined you in front of thousands was to have your past rewritten in real time. She was no longer seen as a ruler who lost a war. She was seen as a spectacle who never should have ruled at all. Rome didn't need words. The fabric did the talking. If Rome wanted to make a point absolutely unmistakable, it added children. Not as an accident, not as collateral damage. as a feature. When captured queens were paraded in triumphs, they were sometimes forced to appear alongside their children. This was not done out of cruelty alone, although cruelty was very much present, but out of calculation. Rome understood that nothing communicates total victory like demonstrating control over the future. A queen without heirs could still inspire rebellion. A queen whose children stood beside her in chains? That was finality with a bow on top. To Roman spectators, the message was devastatingly clear. Not only had Rome defeated the ruler, it had neutralized the bloodline. No avengers waiting in the wings. No rightful heirs growing up beyond Rome's reach. The story ended here, in the street, in front of everyone. Rome liked clean endings. The presence of children also softened the queen's image in a very specific way. Not toward sympathy, but toward inevitability. A woman dragging her children through humiliation was no longer seen as a defiant leader. She was framed as a tragic figure whose resistance had failed not only herself, but those who depended on her. Rome loved that framing. It transferred blame away from the empire and placed it squarely on the defeated ruler. And yes, it was deliberate. Roman audiences were not encouraged to think, "How cruel." They were encouraged to think, "This is what happens when you resist." For the queen, this was perhaps the sharpest edge of punishment. Authority stripped away is one thing. Watching your children become props in Rome's performance was another. Rome did not simply conquer lands, it invaded family bonds and repurposed them as warnings. The children themselves were not always killed. Some were absorbed into Roman households. Some disappeared into obscurity. Some were kept alive as insurance against future rebellions. Rome preferred leverage to bloodshed whenever possible. But survival did not mean freedom. Growing up, Romanized, renamed, and removed from their origins ensured that whatever legacy the queen had built would not continue in recognizable form. Rome did not just end reigns, it redesigned futures. To Rome, this was efficiency. To history, it was chilling. Because the empire understood something most conquerors eventually learn. To truly defeat a ruler, you do not just destroy the throne, you erase the line that could ever reclaim it. When Rome allowed a captured queen to live, it was not being merciful, it was being strategic. Rome did not confuse survival with kindness, and neither should we. Keeping a queen alive was often the most efficient way to extend her punishment indefinitely. A dead queen could inspire rebellion. A living one could suppress it. Rome understood optics. A queen breathing, visible, and thoroughly powerless sent a clearer message than an execution ever could. Her people could not rally around a martyr if the former ruler was still alive, especially if she was seen paraded, imprisoned, or reduced to a name spoken only in whispers. Hope fades faster when the symbol of resistance is still there, visibly broken. So Rome kept some queens alive on purpose. These women were housed in controlled environments, guarded residences, temples, or prisons, where every movement was monitored and every interaction filtered. They were fed, clothed, and medically maintained just enough to remain functional. Think less honoured captive, and more carefully preserved warning sign. The cruelty was subtle, which made it effective. No crowds, no cheering. Just endless days without power, purpose, or agency. Rome understood that rulers accustomed to command did not need chains to feel imprisoned. Silence worked just as well. From Rome's perspective, this was good governance. A living queen could be referenced in negotiations. Her existence could be mentioned casually to discourage uprisings. "You know, she's still alive," was often enough to quiet ambitious leaders who remembered how her resistance ended. And if she stopped being useful? Rome was nothing if not adaptable. Survival also allowed Rome to reshape her story. Over time, the queen became less a ruler and more a rumour. Roman writers redefined her as misguided, reckless, or doomed by her own ambition. The longer she lived under Roman control, the easier it became to convince everyone that her rule had always been unstable. From the Queen's perspective, survival was a slow dismantling. Each day erased another layer of identity. No court, no authority, no voice, just existence without influence. Rome didn't need to torture her physically. It let time do the work. Because for an empire obsessed with control, the most satisfying punishment wasn't death. It was watching power fade, one quiet day at a time. Roman imprisonment was not about iron bars and dramatic dungeon scenes. That would have been far too obvious. For captured queens, imprisonment was subtler and far more effective. Rome didn't just lock them away. It removed everything that had ever made them dangerous. A queen in captivity was not treated like a criminal. She was treated like an inconvenience that needed to be contained politely. She might live in a guarded villa, a temple complex, or a carefully monitored residence rather than a cell. From the outside, it could almost look comfortable, and that was the point. Rome understood that visible comfort softened outrage. A queen kept alive, fed, and housed allowed Rome to claim moral superiority while quietly dismantling her authority. No chains were needed when no one listened to her anymore. The true prison was isolation. Queens were separated from supporters, advisors, and anyone who might remind them of who they had once been. Communication was controlled. Visitors were filtered. Letters vanished mysteriously. Rome did not forbid contact outright. It simply made sure nothing meaningful survived the process. And then there was routine. Endless, dull, carefully structured routine. No decisions to make. No orders to give. No audience. For someone raised to command, routine was a form of psychological erosion. Each day stripped away another layer of relevance. Rome also understood the power of uncertainty. Queens were rarely told how long they would be held. Days blurred into months, months into years. The future existed only as a vague administrative possibility discussed somewhere far away by men who never intended to include her. Occasionally, a Roman official would visit, not to negotiate, not to threaten, just to observe, to remind her that Rome still remembered she existed, and that Rome alone decided when she stopped existing. This was not mercy, it was management. Rome preferred queens alive but inert, visible but silent, remembered but powerless. A living ruler with no authority was proof that Rome's dominance extended beyond battlefields and into identity itself. And for the outside world, the message was quietly reinforced. Resistance does not end with death. Sometimes it ends with years of waiting in a comfortable room where nothing you say matters. For Rome, this was elegant punishment. No blood, no noise, just control, applied slowly, relentlessly, and with impeccable organization. One of Rome's favorite tools was time, not speed, not urgency, time. Rome understood that uncertainty could grind a person down far more efficiently than chains ever could. So when it came to captured queens, Rome rarely announced plans. It simply waited. Queens were almost never told what would happen next. Execution was not scheduled. Release was not discussed. There was no calendar, no countdown, no sense of progression. Just days that blended together, each one quietly identical to the last. Rome believed clarity was a privilege, and defeated rulers had not earned it. From Rome's perspective, this was excellent policy. A queen who did not know her fate could not plan, could not hope properly, and could not prepare herself emotionally for anything in particular. Hope without direction becomes anxiety, and anxiety is exhausting. Rome outsourced much of its punishment to the human mind. Some queens waited months, others waited years. A few waited long enough that their names faded from conversation, their rebellions reduced to footnotes, their existence remembered only by guards who rotated shifts and administrators who filed reports. Rome had patience. Empires always do. And Rome enjoyed flexibility. A living queen could be useful today and inconvenient tomorrow. If her former people stirred, her survival could be mentioned casually as reassurance or threat. If political winds shifted, her execution could be delayed indefinitely Rome liked options. Certainty limited options. The uncertainty also worked outward. Other rulers heard rumours. She is still alive. No, she has been killed. No, she is in Rome. Confusion spread. Fear followed. Rome did not need to clarify. Ambiguity did the job beautifully. For the Queen, this was perhaps the cruelest phase. She had already lost power. Now she lost time itself. Days passed without meaning. Years dissolved without milestones. Waiting became existence. Rome didn't take her life. It took her future, and refused to explain why. Occasionally, hope returned. A new governor, a new emperor, a change in policy. Perhaps mercy would come. Rome allowed those thoughts to live just long enough to be crushed quietly by silence. Rome did not rush punishment because it did not need to. The empire had learned something profound. When you control the timeline, you control the person. And so the Queen waited, and waited, and waited. Because Rome believed the most effective punishment was not knowing when the story ended. Popular imagination likes its executions loud, theatrical, and soaked in spectacle. Rome, however, was a practical empire. When it came time to finally end a captured queen's life, drama was usually unnecessary. The performance had already happened. The lesson had been delivered. What remained was administration. Most executions of captured queens were deliberately private. No crowds, no speeches, no emotional closure. Rome had already used the queen as a symbol in triumphs, rumours, and years of captivity. There was no need to repeat the message. Repetition risked sympathy, and Rome disliked sympathy almost as much as rebellion. Execution, when it happened, was often handled inside prisons or controlled residences. Strangulation was common. It was efficient, quiet, and left no public remains to inspire devotion. Rome preferred methods that did not generate stories. A storyless death was a successful death, and timing mattered. Executions rarely took place immediately after capture. They were delayed until Rome had extracted every possible political benefit. The queen lived only as long as she was useful. Once she became irrelevant, the empire moved on with administrative calm. From Rome's point of view, this was restraint. The empire liked to imagine itself civilized, rational, and above emotional violence. Killing a queen loudly would have suggested anger. Rome preferred the appearance of inevitability. This is simply how things conclude, the silence seemed to say. For the queen, the end came without ceremony. No final speech, no chance to reclaim dignity, no dramatic resistance. Just the quiet realization that the waiting had ended, and Rome had decided she was no longer necessary. And for the world outside, the absence of drama mattered. There was no public execution to mark the moment. No clear ending, just silence, rumours, and eventual forgetting. Rome understood that forgetting was often more effective than fear. Execution was not Rome's grand finale. It was paperwork completed. By the time the queen was gone, her story had already been rewritten, her authority dismantled, and her memory softened into something manageable. The empire did not need her alive or dead. It only needed her irrelevant. And when that condition was met, Rome closed the file. Rome liked to separate spectacle from consequence. The applause came first. The silence came later. By the time a captured queen was executed, the crowd had long gone home. The triumphal decorations had been taken down, and Rome had already moved on to its next victory. This timing was not accidental. It was policy. Public punishment was for education. Death was for closure. Rome understood that crowds were unpredictable. Public executions could stir sympathy, outrage, or inconvenient emotional attachment. A queen killed in front of an audience risked becoming something Rome hated deeply: a martyr. Martyrs inspire stories. Stories inspire resistance. Rome preferred endings that produced paperwork, not legends. So the execution often happened after the city had finished celebrating. When the cheering stopped, when the general returned to private life, when the spectacle faded from memory, That was when Rome acted. Quietly, efficiently, without witnesses who might care. To the Roman public, the queen simply vanished. One day she was a name whispered during the triumph. The next, she was no longer mentioned. Silence replaced outrage. Silence replaced curiosity. Rome trusted silence to do what violence could not. This delay also allowed Rome to control emotional distance. By the time death came, the queen had already been reduced to an abstract idea. No longer a living figure walking the streets in chains, she became a rumour, a footnote, a former problem that had been handled. Executing her at that point felt less like cruelty, and more like closing a chapter everyone had already stopped reading. Rome also benefited diplomatically. Executing a queen immediately could provoke backlash from allies, relatives, or dependent kingdoms. Waiting allowed tensions to cool. By the time death occurred, objections had lost urgency. Rome was very good at letting outrage expire naturally. For the queen, this timing added one last cruelty. The execution came not at the height of attention, but after isolation, waiting, and erasure. There was no dramatic end, just the quiet realization that Rome had finished using her. Rome did not want its enemies remembered at their strongest. It wanted them remembered at their weakest, or not at all. And so the queen died, not as a ruler, not as a rebel, not even as a symbol. She died after the applause, when no one was listening. Which, from Rome's perspective, was exactly the point. For Rome, killing a queen was not always the final step. Sometimes it was unnecessary. Sometimes it was inefficient. The most thorough punishment was not death, but disappearance. Rome had a talent for making people vanish without ever leaving a body behind. Erasure was subtle. It didn't require chains, guards, or witnesses. It required scribes. Roman historians, poets, and officials controlled the narrative, and they used that power generously. Queens who had once commanded armies and territories were reduced to brief mentions, distorted anecdotes, or vague warnings about barbarian women. Their names were misspelled, minimized, or omitted entirely. Rome did not deny that these queens existed. It simply made sure they did not matter. This was not accidental. Rome understood that memory is power. If people remember a ruler clearly, they may remember why they followed her. If they forget her, loyalty dissolves on its own. Rome preferred forgetting. It required no troops. In some cases, queens were absorbed into Roman life so quietly that history lost track of them altogether. They were renamed, reassigned, married off, converted into polite footnotes living under Roman supervision. Official records stopped referring to them as queens. They became wives, daughters, or foreign women, stripped of the very titles that once made them threatening. Even when queens were remembered, Rome rewrote their personalities. Leadership became arrogance, strategy became recklessness, resistance became madness. Roman writers rarely described these women as competent rulers. That would have suggested Rome faced legitimate opposition. Instead, they were portrayed as emotional, impulsive, or doomed by their own ambition. The ancient equivalent of saying, "This was never going to work anyway." Rome's version of history did not shout. It whispered. Over time, those whispers became accepted truth. And the most effective part? Rome made erasure look natural. Future generations assumed these queens were minor figures because Rome told the story that way. No monuments, no celebrations, no names carved in stone, just absence. For the queen, this punishment extended beyond death. Even her memory was no longer hers. She did not just lose her throne, her freedom, or her life. She lost her place in time. Rome did not always need to destroy its enemies. Sometimes it simply edited them out. And that, for an empire obsessed with permanence, was the ultimate victory. Rome did not leave history to chance. It employed writers. And Roman writers, knowingly or not, were some of the empire's most effective executioners. Once a captured queen was defeated, humiliated, imprisoned, erased, or quietly killed, Roman authors stepped in to finish the job. They didn't need chains or guards. They had parchment. And parchment lasts longer than fear. These writers rarely described queens as capable leaders who posed a genuine threat. That would have implied Rome faced serious opposition, which was unacceptable. Instead, queens were reframed as cautionary tales. Their courage became recklessness. Their political skill became manipulation. Their resistance became hysteria. Rome did not argue against these women. It caricatured them. This was done with an air of intellectual superiority. Roman authors presented themselves as calm, rational observers describing irrational figures. The implication was clear. Rome was reason. Resistance was madness. If a queen fought back, it was not because she had strategic goals or popular support. It was because she was emotional, unstable, or doomed by her own ambition. And because Rome controlled education, these portrayals spread. Future scholars learned Roman versions of events. Later historians copied Roman sources. The queens became what Rome said they were, not because it was accurate, but because it was written first and written often. What makes this particularly effective is how subtle it was. Roman writers didn't scream insults. They sighed. They shook their heads on the page. They framed the queen as someone who might have succeeded if only she had known her place. Condescension replaced cruelty, and that made the damage feel reasonable. Even praise, when it appeared, was poisonous. A queen might be described as brave, but only to emphasize how tragic her inevitable failure was. Clever, but fatally misguided. Strong, but unnatural. Compliments that end in inevitability are not compliments at all. By the time centuries passed, the queen was no longer remembered as a ruler who challenged Rome. She was remembered as a mistake that proved Rome's worldview correct. Rome understood something vital. Killing a ruler ends resistance in the present. Writing about them incorrectly prevents resistance in the future. So while soldiers captured queens and officials decided their fate, it was the historians who ensured those queens never truly recovered. They did not just lose their kingdoms. They lost their reputations, and in Rome's empire, that loss was permanent. Rome never punished captured queens for their own sake. That would have been inefficient. Rome punished them for the benefit of everyone else. Every chain, every parade, every carefully timed disappearance was aimed outward, not inward. The queen was merely the delivery system. Empires survive on reputation. Rome knew this. Its armies were strong, yes, but its greatest weapon was expectation. Kingdoms surrendered not just because Rome might win, but because Rome was expected to win. Captured queens helped maintain that expectation. When a foreign ruler watched a Roman triumph, they were not supposed to feel curiosity. They were supposed to feel calculation. If I resist, they were meant to think, this is how it ends. Not quickly, not cleanly, but slowly, publicly, and with paperwork. Rome understood that fear works best when it looks organized. Random brutality creates chaos. Systematic punishment creates obedience. The fate of captured queens was not improvised cruelty. It was policy dressed up as inevitability. The message was especially pointed toward other rulers with influence. Rome wanted them to see that status offered no protection. Royal blood did not grant mercy. Titles did not negotiate better outcomes. In fact, they made punishment worse. The higher you stood, the longer Rome took dismantling you. And the message travelled. Merchants carried stories. Diplomats whispered details. Roman writers embroidered the narrative just enough to make resistance sound foolish. Rome did not need to threaten anyone directly. It let the example speak. There was also a quiet warning aimed at Rome's own allies. Loyalty was rewarded, but independence was not. A queen who stepped outside Roman authority, even briefly, risked becoming a cautionary tale. Cooperation looked safer by comparison. Rome rarely said, "Obey us." It said, "Look what happened to her." And perhaps the most chilling part is how normalized this became. Over time, the punishment of captured queens stopped feeling extraordinary. It became expected. When another ruler fell, people didn't ask what Rome would do. They asked how long it would take. Rome succeeded because it made domination feel predictable, and predictability feels permanent. So when Rome punished captured queens, it wasn't acting out of cruelty alone. It was maintaining an image, one that stretched far beyond the empire's borders and long past the queen's lifetime. She suffered, but the lesson was never meant for her. In the end, Rome did not punish captured queens because they were weak. Rome punished them because they were dangerous, even after defeat. A queen represented an idea Rome could never fully control, authority that did not originate in Rome and did not require Roman approval. Empires can tolerate enemies. They can tolerate rebels. What they struggle with are alternatives. A ruling queen embodied the uncomfortable possibility that power could exist outside Rome's carefully managed hierarchy. She had ruled without Roman law, Roman gods, Roman armies, or Roman paperwork. People had followed her willingly. That fact alone was unsettling enough to warrant correction. Rome was not insecure, but it was thorough. It did not like loose ends, unresolved symbols, or lingering doubts. A captured queen was all three. Leaving her untreated, unprocessed, or insufficiently humiliated risked inspiring the wrong conclusions. Rome preferred its lessons unmistakable, so it dismantled queens piece by piece. First, authority, then dignity, then time, then memory. Rome did not rush. It did not need to. It had centuries to reinforce the same message over and over again. Resist, and you will not simply lose. You will be displayed, delayed, erased, and rewritten. And here is the quiet irony. Rome's harsh treatment of captured queens reveals just how seriously it took them. Empires do not waste energy humiliating insignificant opponents. They reserve that effort for figures who might otherwise be remembered as legitimate alternatives. Queens were punished so carefully because they mattered. Even Rome's historians betrayed this fear. The need to belittle, distort, and diminish these women long after their deaths suggests anxiety, not confidence. Rome wanted future generations to believe these queens were inevitable failures, not leaders who nearly succeeded. And yet, we still talk about them. Despite Rome's best efforts, their stories survived. Fragmented, distorted, incomplete, but alive. Each remembered queen represents a crack in Rome's narrative of inevitability, proof that resistance once existed and was strong enough to worry the most powerful empire of its time. Rome won the wars. Rome controlled the records, but Rome never fully controlled memory. And perhaps that is the final failure. Because an empire that fears how its enemies might be remembered reveals something deeply human beneath all that marble and law. Even Rome was afraid of being challenged. Medieval London did not create crime, but it certainly made it comfortable. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the city was bursting at the seams, with perhaps 80,000 people packed inside old Roman walls, never designed for that many bodies, carts, animals, and ambitions. Streets were narrow, crooked, and often unnamed. Houses leaned outward as each new floor was added, blocking sunlight and trapping smells. If you were looking for order, light, or personal space, you chose the wrong century. Most Londoners lived and worked in the same cramped building. A butcher slept above his shop. An alewife brewed, served, and raised children in the same smoky room. At night, shutters closed, candles flickered, and entire neighbourhoods sank into darkness. There were no streetlights. Moonlight was a luxury. Shadows were everywhere, and they were excellent accomplices. Crime thrived because opportunity was constant. Crowded markets meant distracted customers. Pilgrims and foreign merchants arrived daily with purses full of coin and no idea where they were going. The taverns spilled drunk men into the streets after curfew. Apprentices slept 10 to a room. Servants carried goods through alleys barely wide enough for 2 shoulders. If you wanted to steal, you did not need skill, you needed patience. London's layout did not help law enforcement. The city was divided into wards, each responsible for its own policing. That policing consisted mostly of unpaid local men doing night watch duty with staves and lanterns, assuming they stayed awake. They were neighbours, not professionals, and they knew exactly who lived where, which made enforcing the law awkward. Arresting a stranger was easy. Arresting your cousin was another matter entirely. Then there was the river. The Thames was London's highway, dumping ground, and escape route all in one. Stolen goods vanished onto boats. Bodies occasionally did too. Docks drew sailors, labourers, prostitutes, thieves, and gamblers in equal measure. Where money moved, crime followed. London was also a magnet. If you were poor, desperate, or running from something, the city promised work, anonymity, and chaos. For many, it delivered only hunger and temptation. Theft was not always a career choice. Often, it was a short-term survival strategy that went very wrong. In short, medieval London was noisy, filthy, overcrowded, poorly lit, and loosely policed. It was not a city designed to prevent crime. It was a city that quietly invited it in, shut the door, and pretended not to notice until someone screamed. If medieval London had a background noise, it was the rustle of fingers where they did not belong. Pickpocketing was the most common crime in the city, and also the hardest to stop. Crowds were everywhere. Markets, churchyards, processions, executions and festivals all packed people shoulder to shoulder. Where bodies pressed together, hands wandered. The typical target was not a wealthy noble. It was the ordinary man who carried his entire fortune on his belt. Coins were kept in purses tied with cords, worn openly for convenience and necessity. There were no banks for daily wages. If you earned money, you carried it. And if you carried it, someone noticed. Cut purses specialised in removing those purses with small knives, slicing cords cleanly and quietly. The victim often felt nothing until the weight was gone. Some thieves worked alone, but many operated in groups. One person bumped the target, another shouted or spilled ale, a third made the cut. By the time confusion settled, the purse had already changed hands twice. Children were frequently involved. Orphans and runaways learned quickly that small hands raised less suspicion. They were trained to watch for distracted merchants, drunk sailors, or pilgrims staring at relics instead of their belongings. If caught, children might be beaten or branded, but many judges hesitated to hang them. This made them useful tools in a brutal system. Markets were prime hunting grounds. Buyers focused on haggling. Sellers focused on profit. Thieves focused on both. Church crowds were equally tempting. Piety did not protect your purse, and sermons about sin did little to discourage someone who had not eaten in days. Punishment for theft depended on value. Small thefts might result in fines, time in the stocks, or whipping. Larger sums meant branding on the cheek or forehead, marking the thief forever. Repeat offenders faced mutilation, usually the loss of an ear or hand. Hanging waited at the end of the path, visible to everyone and carefully remembered. Public shame was part of the system. Thieves were paraded through streets, mocked, spat on, and sometimes pelted with rotten food. The goal was deterrence through humiliation, though it often created hardened criminals instead. Despite this, pickpocketing never disappeared. It adapted. Thieves learned new tricks. Londoners learned to clutch their purses tighter. The city accepted it as part of daily life, like mud on boots or smoke in the air. In medieval London, losing your money was not shocking. It was expected. Taverns were where medieval London went to relax, which is precisely why they were where trouble gathered. Ale was cheap, safer than water, and consumed in heroic quantities. By sunset, many taverns were already loud. By nightfall, they were dangerous. Drink loosened tongues, blurred loyalties, and turned small insults into matters of honour that absolutely required fists. Most tavern brawls began over nothing worth remembering. A spilled cup, a disputed dice throw, a perceived insult to a woman who may or may not have been present. Once voices rose, others joined in quickly, either out of loyalty, boredom, or the simple joy of chaos. Benches became weapons. Tankards flew. Knives appeared faster than anyone later admitted. Weapons were common. Men carried daggers as tools as much as arms. Apprentices were forbidden by law from carrying swords, which did not stop them. Sailors brought knives from the docks. Even a broken bottle or a fire poker could become lethal. A brawl that started with shouting could end with a body on the floor and no clear idea of who struck the final blow. Street violence often followed. When taverns closed at curfew, drunk patrons spilled into alleys already dark and narrow. Fights continued outside, sometimes drawing in watchmen who were just as likely to be attacked as assisted. Night watch patrols were poorly paid and poorly trained. Many preferred to shout warnings from a distance rather than intervene directly. The law treated violence seriously, but unevenly. If no one died, punishments ranged from fines to time in the pillory. Serious injuries could lead to imprisonment. Homicide complicated matters. Killing in self-defense was theoretically excusable, but proving it was difficult. Witnesses were often drunk, biased, or conveniently absent. Guild rivalries also fueled violence. Apprentices from different trades clashed regularly, especially during festivals. Bakers fought butchers. Fishmongers fought just about everyone. These were not random fights. They were expressions of identity, loyalty, and long-standing grudges, carried out with enthusiasm and very little planning. Authorities attempted crackdowns, imposing curfews and banning weapons in taverns, but enforcement was inconsistent. Tavern owners depended on rowdy customers. Watchmen depended on not getting stabbed. In the end, tavern violence was tolerated because it was familiar. As long as it stayed within certain bounds, London accepted bruises, broken bones, and the occasional corpse as the price of a city that drank together every night. Medieval London officially disapproved of prostitution, while quietly relying on it. Brothels were considered a necessary evil, a way to prevent worse sins, by channeling male desire into regulated spaces. The city did not ban them outright. Instead, it tried to control them, which meant accepting that sex work was part of urban life, as long as it stayed where authorities could see it. Most legal brothels were concentrated in specific districts, especially Southwark, across the Thames. This area fell under different jurisdiction, conveniently outside the direct control of London's civic authorities. Brothels paid fees, followed rules, and submitted to inspections. Prostitutes were required to wear identifying clothing so they could not be mistaken for honest women, a distinction that mattered deeply in court and on the street. Despite regulation, brothel raids were common. Officials periodically staged moral crackdowns, often during times of political unrest or religious pressure. These raids were less about ending prostitution and more about demonstrating authority. Women were arrested, fined, publicly shamed, or briefly imprisoned, then released back into the same system that had just punished them. Clients were rarely targeted. Men caught during raids were usually warned or ignored entirely, unless they were clergy, married, or politically inconvenient. The burden of morality fell almost entirely on women, especially those without powerful protectors. Illegal brothels also thrived. Some operated out of taverns, bathhouses, or private homes. Others were little more than rooms rented by the night. These spaces lacked protection and were more vulnerable to violence, theft, and exploitation. Prostitutes in illegal establishments could be beaten, robbed, or arrested with little recourse. Sex-related crimes extended beyond prostitution. Adultery, fornication, and sodomy were all subject to punishment, though enforcement depended heavily on witnesses and reputation. Accusations could destroy lives even without proof. A woman's word carried less weight than a man's, and a poor woman's word barely registered at all. Punishments ranged from fines and public penance to imprisonment. In severe or repeated cases, banishment from the city was possible. Public shame was again the preferred weapon. Offenders were paraded, named, and marked as moral failures, their reputations permanently damaged. Brothel raids gave the appearance of moral order while changing very little. The city needed sex workers, sailors needed distraction, and officials needed revenue. Crime in this case was not something medieval London wanted to eliminate. It simply wanted to manage it quietly, preferably without admitting how dependent it truly was. Theft in medieval London was not just a crime, it was a public spectacle waiting to happen. The city believed deeply in visible punishment. Justice was meant to be seen, remembered, and feared. If someone stole, the goal was not rehabilitation. It was warning. Petty theft, such as stealing bread, tools, or clothing, was common, especially during hard winters or food shortages. Courts understood desperation, but rarely excused it. A first-time offender might face a fine or whipping. If they could not pay, which most could not, the punishment became physical. Pain replaced money as currency. Branding was especially feared. A hot iron pressed into the cheek, forehead, or hand marked a thief forever. The mark announced their crime to employers, neighbours, and strangers alike. Once branded, finding honest work became nearly impossible, which quietly encouraged repeat offending. The system created the criminals it claimed to deter. More serious thefts led to mutilation. Ears were cut off. Hands were severed. These punishments were legal, ritualized, and performed publicly. The crowd watched not only for entertainment, but for instruction. Children were brought along to learn consequences early. Execution waited at the far end of the scale. Hanging was the usual method, carried out at sites like Tyburn. Theft above a certain value, or repeated offences, could send a person to the gallows. The threshold for a capital theft was low. A coat, a purse, or a few coins could be enough. Fear shaped daily behaviour. Londoners locked chests, hid valuables, and travelled in groups. Shops installed shutters and bars. People memorised faces, especially those of known criminals. Rumours spread quickly, often exaggerating danger, turning strangers into threats. Yet public punishment also bred sympathy. Crowds sometimes prayed for the condemned. Occasionally they intervened, cutting down a hanging body early in hopes of survival. Executions were terrifying, but they were also communal events, blending justice, religion, and uneasy compassion. Authorities believed harsh punishment preserved order. In reality, it created a city tense with anxiety. Theft did not vanish. It adapted. Criminals became faster, quieter, more selective. Ordinary people learned to live alert, suspicious, and prepared to lose everything in a single careless moment. In medieval London, fear was not a side effect of crime. It was part of the system, carefully cultivated, publicly displayed, and deeply felt by everyone who walked the streets with something worth stealing. When the sun went down in medieval London, the city did not sleep so much as surrender. Darkness transformed familiar streets into uncertain territory. Without streetlights, only candles and hearth fires provided scattered points of glow, and most households extinguished them early to save money. The result was a city where shadows ruled and crimes multiplied. Night was when theft turned bold. Burglars targeted homes and shops, prying shutters, forcing doors, or slipping through unguarded windows. Even churches were not spared. Sacred spaces held valuable vessels, candles, and offerings, and thieves rarely worried about divine punishment when hunger or greed pressed harder. Sacrilege was illegal, but it was also profitable. The city relied on the night watch to maintain order. These watchmen were local men required to serve by obligation, not by desire. They were unpaid or poorly paid, poorly equipped, and often elderly or inexperienced. Armed with staves and lanterns, they patrolled wards in small groups, calling out the hours and watching for suspicious activity. In theory. In practice, many dozed, drank, or avoided confrontation. Challenging armed thieves in narrow alleys was dangerous, and there was little incentive to be brave. A wounded watchman received no compensation. A dead one received prayers. Criminals knew this, and treated the watch as an inconvenience rather than a threat. Curfews were enforced unevenly. Bells signalled when lawful movement should stop, but taverns, brothels, and private gatherings ignored them regularly. Anyone caught outside after curfew could be questioned or detained, but enforcement depended on who you were. Respectable merchants passed more easily than servants or foreigners. Night also concealed violence. Assaults, robberies, and murders were harder to investigate in darkness. Witnesses disappeared. Evidence vanished. Many cases went unsolved, recorded only as rumours or unexplained deaths. The river absorbed secrets efficiently. The city attempted reforms. More watchmen, stricter curfews, better equipment. None solved the underlying problem. London was too large, too dark, and too crowded for effective nighttime control. For ordinary people, night meant risk. Doors were barred, windows shuttered. Families huddled inside. Travel after dark was avoided unless necessary. Those who moved through the city at night did so with purpose, fear, or both. In medieval London, daylight belonged to law and commerce. Night belonged to opportunity, desperation, and the quiet understanding that once darkness fell, help was uncertain and justice could wait until morning. Medieval London's prisons were not places of punishment in the modern sense. They were holding pens, designed to keep bodies contained until a decision was made. Justice moved slowly, and while it did, prisoners waited in conditions that were often worse than the sentence itself. The most infamous prison was Newgate. Its reputation alone inspired fear. Prisoners paid for everything: food, bedding, chains, and even the removal of chains. Those with money lived slightly better. Those without it suffered. Hunger, filth, and disease were constant companions. Rats moved freely. So did lice. Debtors, thieves, murder suspects, and political prisoners were all mixed together. There was little separation by crime, age, or gender. Violence inside prisons was common, and guards often looked the other way unless bribed. Survival depended on connections, strength, or luck. Justice relied heavily on accusation and testimony. Investigations were brief. Evidence was often circumstantial. Juries were composed of local men who might already know the accused or the victim. Reputation mattered enormously. A known troublemaker was easier to condemn than a respected guild member, regardless of facts. Trials could be swift once they began, but reaching that point took time. Prisoners waited weeks or months, unsure whether they would be fined, maimed, banished, or killed. Anxiety was part of the punishment. Confessions were sometimes encouraged through pressure rather than force, though outright torture was rare in England compared to elsewhere. Not all justice was harsh. Courts occasionally showed mercy, especially to first-time offenders or those with community support. Pardons were possible, often granted during religious festivals or royal celebrations. Charity existed alongside cruelty, though unpredictably. Public trust in justice was fragile. Some saw courts as necessary protectors. Others saw them as tools of the powerful. Corruption was an open secret. Bribes could soften sentences. Influence could erase charges. The poor understood that law was not blind. It looked very closely at your status. Prisons embodied this imbalance. They punished poverty as much as crime. For many, the mere act of being imprisoned destroyed their livelihood, family, and future, regardless of outcome. In medieval London, justice was not only about guilt or innocence. It was about endurance. If you survived the waiting, the filth, and the fear, whatever sentence followed might almost feel like a conclusion rather than a beginning. Execution day in medieval London was not quiet, solemn, or private. It was loud, crowded, and disturbingly festive. When word spread that someone was to hang, people came out in force. Vendors sold food, children climbed for a better view. What was meant to inspire fear often slid into entertainment. Most executions took place at established sites such as Tyburn, just outside the city. Condemned prisoners were marched through the streets, sometimes tied to a hurdle or cart, giving the crowd time to gather. This procession mattered. It transformed punishment into a moral lesson on display, a final warning delivered step by step. Hanging was the usual method, especially for thieves. It was simple, cheap, and public. Death was not always quick. Short drops meant slow strangulation. The crowd watched everything. Some jeered, others prayed. A few shouted encouragement, hoping the condemned would repent loudly enough to save their soul, if not their body. Executions reinforced social order. Criminals were shown as cautionary examples, not tragic figures. Yet sympathy often crept in. Many condemned were young, poor, or clearly terrified. Mothers fainted. Friends wept. Sometimes the crowd intervened, pulling on legs to hasten death, an act of grim mercy. Bodies were sometimes left hanging for hours or days, especially in notorious cases. This was meant to extend the lesson. Rotting corpses marked the boundary between law and chaos. Londoners learned where not to step, literally and morally. Not all executions were equal. Nobles convicted of serious crimes might be beheaded instead, a cleaner and faster death. Status followed you to the scaffold. Even in death, hierarchy mattered. Religious rituals softened the moment. Priests offered prayers. Confessions were encouraged. A well-spoken final speech could earn respect or forgiveness. A defiant one could earn hatred. Last words mattered because they were remembered, repeated, and sometimes written down. Execution days revealed a contradiction at the heart of medieval justice. The city wanted fear, order, and obedience, but it also craved drama. Punishment was law, theatre, and morality play combined. For Londoners, the gallows were not abstract threats. They were familiar landmarks. Everyone knew someone who had stood there, waiting. Crime ended lives publicly, loudly, and in full view, ensuring no one forgot what the city demanded in return for order. Crime in medieval London was not an interruption to daily life. It was woven into it. People did not expect safety in the modern sense. They expected risk, loss, and the constant need to stay alert. Survival meant adapting rather than resisting. Londoners learned habits early. Purses were tied tightly and worn under clothing when possible. Doors were barred at dusk. Neighbours listened for unfamiliar footsteps. Strangers were watched carefully, especially at markets and taverns. Trust existed, but it was cautious and conditional. Communities policed themselves as much as the law did. Reputation mattered. A known thief found doors closed and work scarce. Gossip spread faster than official warnings. At the same time, communities protected their own. Witnesses sometimes lied. Juries hesitated to condemn neighbours they knew, even when guilt was obvious. Justice bent under familiarity. Fear shaped social behaviour. Women avoided certain streets alone. Merchants travelled in groups. Apprentices learned which taverns were safest and which to leave before nightfall. Parents warned children not with abstract morals, but with real examples. Everyone knew names of the executed. Everyone knew where it happened. Religion framed crime as sin, but hunger often framed it as necessity. Many criminals did not see themselves as villains. They were labourers without work, servants dismissed without wages, migrants without connections. London attracted them with promise and punished them for believing it. The authorities understood this tension, but rarely addressed its causes. Harsh punishment was easier than reform. Public executions were cheaper than welfare. The city preferred fear over solutions, spectacle over stability. Despite everything, London endured. Trade continued. Taverns stayed full. Markets reopened the day after executions. Crime did not destroy the city. It shaped it. The constant negotiation between danger and order forged a population resilient, suspicious, and deeply practical. Medieval Londoners lived knowing the rules could protect them one day and destroy them the next. Law was visible, violence was public, and survival depended on awareness more than innocence. In the end, crime in medieval London was not an anomaly. It was a consequence of density, poverty, opportunity, and human nature, playing out in narrow streets beneath leaning houses, watched by neighbours who knew exactly how fragile safety really was. Vercingetorix was born into power long before he ever imagined rebellion. His people, the Arverni, were not a minor Gallic tribe tucked away in forests and hills. They were one of the dominant powers of Central Gaul, wealthy, militarily respected, and deeply proud of their lineage. To be born Arvernian nobility meant growing up surrounded by authority, expectation, and constant reminders of who you were supposed to become. His family stood near the top of this hierarchy. His father, Celtillus, was no ordinary chieftain. He was influential enough to aspire to kingship, a dangerous ambition in a Gallic world that distrusted centralized power. Among the Arverni, leadership was shared, negotiated, and constantly contested. A man who reached too high risked being accused of tyranny by his own people. From early childhood, Vercingetorix would have been immersed in a warrior aristocracy. Status was proven through courage, generosity, and loyalty, not paperwork or titles. Young boys of noble families were raised to fight, ride, hunt, and endure pain without complaint. Strength was admired, but restraint mattered too. A future leader needed discipline as much as ferocity. He grew up hearing names of ancestors spoken with reverence, their deeds recited during feasts where meat was carved publicly, and honour was distributed along with food. These gatherings were not just celebrations, they were lessons. Every story reinforced the idea that nobility carried obligation. You defended your people. You upheld tradition. You remembered slights. The Arverni world was intensely political. Alliances shifted. Rival clans watched one another carefully. Even within noble families, loyalty could fracture under pressure. Vercingetorix would have learned early that power was fragile, and that admiration could turn to suspicion overnight. And then there was Rome. Not yet an occupying force in his childhood, but a growing presence in stories, trade, and rumours. Rome was distant but looming, described as wealthy, disciplined, and dangerously organised. For a young noble, Rome was both a curiosity and a warning. Vercingetorix's birth placed him inside a system that valued strength, memory, and independence above all else. He was raised not to obey quietly, but to lead loudly. That identity, forged before he ever held a sword in battle, would shape every choice he made once loyalty, survival, and revenge collided. Vercingetorix grew up in a world where memory mattered more than ink.